stand on a hillside in the Scottish Highlands and look out across the landscape, what you will see is beautiful. There is no doubt about that. The purple heather rolling away in every direction. The dark lochs sitting still in the valley floors. The mountains rising behind them with their tops hidden in cloud. It is one of the most dramatic landscapes in Europe, and people come from across the world to stand exactly where you are standing and feel exactly the emotion you are feeling, which is something between awe and smallness. But if you know what you are looking at, there is something else underneath that awe, a kind of wrongness you cannot immediately name. The hillside is too bare. The valleys are too open. The silence, which at first feels like wildness, is actually closer to emptiness. Because what looks like a wild place is, in ecological terms, one of the most stripped and degraded landscapes in the developed world. Britain ranks 189th out of 218 countries in terms of what scientists call biodiversity intactness. That means that out of all the nations on Earth, almost every single one of them has more of its original natural state intact than Britain does. This rugged, ancient, spectacular landscape that draws millions of visitors every year is, by the hard measure of wildlife science, nearly empty. The wolves that once held this place together were hunted to extinction centuries ago. The lynx that controlled the deer before that disappeared even earlier. The bears are gone. Most of the native forest is gone too, replaced by heather moorland managed for grouse shooting or by vast blanket bogs, and open hill ground grazed bare by the deer that now have no natural predators to keep their numbers in check. What you are looking at when you look at the Scottish Highlands is not ancient wilderness. It is the aftermath of one of the longest and most complete wildlife clearances in recorded history. And then, somewhere above you in the mist, a golden eagle tips its wings into the wind and holds position against the grey sky. And for a moment the wrongness recedes, because this at least is real. This at least survived. This great dark bird, with its wingspan wider than a tall person stands, is still here. It is doing what it has always done in these hills, which is to patrol the edge of what remains and press everything below it into a kind of alertness that nothing else in this landscape can produce. It is the last great predator of the Scottish Highlands, and it is not enough, but it is something. Tell me where in the world you are watching this from. Drop it in the comments. This story reaches into something older and wilder than most of us get to touch in daily life, and I want to know who is receiving it. Now, let us go into the hills. To understand what the Scottish Highlands once were, you have to understand what was here before. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and the glaciers retreated north, a landscape began to emerge from beneath the ice that would spend the next several thousand years filling up with life. Our dense native forests spread across the hills and valleys, a mix of Scots pine, birch, rowan, aspen and oak that historians and ecologists sometimes call the Caledonian Forest, after the Roman name for the country. Within those forests lived wolves, lynx, bears, wild boar, beavers, and the whole cascading community of species that each of those animals supported through their presence. The deer existed, but their numbers were kept in check by predators that pursued them through every season and kept them moving, preventing any one area from being grazed to ruin. The Romans called the northern forests of Scotland the Great Wood of Caledon, and their accounts suggest it was a formidable place. Deep, tangled, full of animals they could not easily identify, and people who used the density of the forest as both home and fortress. Over the following centuries, the forests were cleared for timber, for charcoal, for agriculture, for the expansion of sheep grazing, and for the deliberate management of the land into the form that suited the wealthy landowners who came to dominate the Scottish Highlands. The wolves and lynx were systematically killed because they took livestock and because eliminating them was a demonstration of control over the land. The last wolf in Scotland was killed in the late 1600s. The lynx had disappeared even earlier, probably more than 1,000 years ago, perhaps longer. And without those predators, the deer populations expanded into the space that had been created for them and began eating the landscape into the form you see today. There are now hundreds of thousands of red deer in Scotland, and they have no natural predators. None. The forests can't regenerate because every young tree that pushes its head above the heather is immediately cropped by a deer. Scotland has roughly 4% forest cover, one of the lowest rates in Europe. This is not the natural state of the landscape. This is what happens when you remove the animals that regulate the animals that regulate the trees. And the deer at the center of this story are themselves extraordinary creatures, whose annual drama of the rut is one of the most primal and beautiful wildlife spectacles Britain produces. The red deer stag in autumn is a creature that has moved out of its normal register and into something else entirely. For most of the year, stags and hinds live separate lives. The males group together in loose bachelor herds on the high ground. The females and their calves occupying the lower slopes in larger groups. They are watchful and somewhat shy, moving away from disturbance with an efficiency that suggests a long memory for the kinds of trouble that can arrive from the direction of a human. They are also undeniably magnificent. The largest land mammals in Britain, heavy-bodied and long-legged, with coats that shift through autumn from red-brown to a darker, greyer shade as the temperature drops. The mature stags carry antlers of extraordinary architecture, branching structures that can span 2 meters in a dominant animal, and that are grown and shed and regrown every single year, a metabolic feat that requires enormous energy from an animal already living in one of Europe's most nutrient-poor landscapes. But in autumn, something fundamental changes. The breeding season arrives like a switch being thrown, and the stag, who was careful and quiet on the high ground, descends into the valleys and begins to announce himself. The roaring of a red deer stag during the rut carries for considerable distances across the still Highland air, a sound unlike anything else this landscape produces. It is not a bellow in the way you might imagine. It is deeper than that, more resonant, something that vibrates at a frequency that seems to reach back into a time when this sound was accompanied by wolves and bears, and the full machinery of a complete ecosystem. The roar is a claim. It says, "I am here, I am large, I am healthy enough to make this sound continuously for weeks. Come challenge me if you dare." Other stags hear the roar and respond, or do not respond, depending on their own assessment of their chances. When 2 evenly matched stags decide the situation calls for confrontation, the approach has a ritualized quality that speaks to millions of years of refinement. They walk parallel to each other first, displaying their size and their antlers, and their overall condition to each other in a kind of slow-motion comparison. If neither retreats at this stage, the confrontation escalates into a direct clash, the two animals locking antlers and pushing against each other with the full weight of their bodies. The ground churns. The breath comes in visible clouds in the cold air. The sound is of something deep and physical and old. In serious fights, animals can be injured or killed, pushed off slopes or stabbed by the interlocking antlers. The stag that wins gathers hinds into his vicinity and defends them through weeks of relentless effort that will leave him visibly depleted by the end of it, having spent so much energy on roaring and fighting and mating that he enters winter thin and vulnerable, with the long cold months ahead still to survive. It is one of the most compelling wildlife displays in Europe, and it plays out every autumn across Highland glens that are otherwise almost silent. The problem is not the deer themselves. The problem is what the absence of predators has allowed deer numbers to grow to, and what that overabundance does to everything else in the landscape. When deer are everywhere, in numbers that no natural predator is keeping in check, every young tree is food. Every attempt at natural forest regeneration is ended before it begins. The dense, living, multi-layered forest that once covered these hills cannot grow back because the deer eat the future before it has a chance to become the present. Above all of this, the golden eagle watches. It has been watching for a long time. Golden eagles are among the oldest recorded wildlife in Britain, with cultural references stretching back through thousands of years of Scottish history, appearing in clan symbols and mythology, and the deepest layers of the country's relationship with its own landscape. And unlike most of the apex predators that once shared these hills, the golden eagle survived. Barely in some periods. Persecuted by gamekeepers who believed, and sometimes correctly, that it took game birds and young lambs. Shot, poisoned, are its eggs taken by collectors in the Victorian era when the destruction of raptors was treated as legitimate estate management. The golden eagle was pushed back and reduced until its range in Britain contracted to the most remote and least accessible parts of the Scottish Highlands and the Western Islands. And then, slowly, protections took hold. Persecution became illegal. Attitudes shifted. And the eagle, which had held on in the most inhospitable corners of its former range, began its partial recovery. A golden eagle covers enormous territory. A single breeding pair may patrol an area of hill and glen so large that it takes a full day to walk from one boundary to the other. They are not social birds outside of the pair bond, which is one of the most stable partnerships in the bird world, with the same male and female returning to the same territory year after year, adding to the same nest that their predecessors may have used before them. Those nests, called eyries, are built on remote cliff ledges or in ancient trees, and a well-established eyrie that has been used and added to across generations can reach enormous proportions, a monument to continuity in a landscape that has changed almost everything else around it. The eagle's hunting is an exercise in patience and precision rather than pure speed. It quarries by coursing low over ground, using the contours of the hill to hide its approach until it is close enough to commit to a strike. Rabbits and hares form the core of its diet across most of its range, supplemented by mountain hares, grouse, and occasionally larger prey. It has been documented taking young deer calves, which is one of the reasons it was historically persecuted, and which occasionally still makes it a target for illegal killing on estates where the income from deer stalking is considered more valuable than the presence of a protected raptor. The golden eagle is the closest thing the Scottish Highlands has to an apex predator. It is magnificent, and it matters, and its partial recovery is one of the genuine conservation successes this landscape can point to. But it is not a wolf. It does not create the landscape of fear that a large ground predator does. The constant pressure that keeps deer moving, that prevents any one valley from being grazed to bare ground, that gives young trees a chance. The eagle hunts the margins. What the Highlands are missing is something that hunts the centre. In the deepest cover of the remaining Highland forests, something moves that almost no one sees. Low to the ground, moving with the fluid, unhurried confidence of an animal that has no reason to hurry, because it has been the master of this particular kind of terrain for longer than humans have been farming it. It is striped in a way that looks like a tabby cat, but is not quite. The tail is thick and blunt-tipped, banded in rings that don't taper. The eyes, when they catch the light, carry an expression that domestic cats sometimes approximate but never quite achieve. This is the Scottish wildcat, the Highland tiger, and it is in so much trouble that a significant number of scientists believe it may already be functionally gone. The wildcat was once found across the entire British mainland. Wolves and bears and boar and all the other large animals that have since disappeared shared the forests with it, and the wildcat was the top cat, the apex feline of the British Isles, occupying the predatory niche that lynx covered in continental Europe, but doing so as a smaller, more nocturnal, more secretive version of the same fundamental ecological role. It hunted rabbits and hares and voles and birds, and it kept those populations in check. And it was so committed to solitude and so intolerant of human proximity that for most of recorded history it was known mainly as a shadow, a sound, an occasional glimpse at the edge of a field on a dark morning. By the early 20th century, systematic persecution by gamekeepers had pushed it out of England entirely and restricted it to the northern Highlands of Scotland. The Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981 gave it legal protection, and for a while it seemed as though that protection might be enough. But then a different threat emerged, one that no law could easily address. Domestic and feral cats, which had been present in Britain for over 2,000 years, began hybridizing with the wildcat population in earnest in the decades following the Second World War. No one is entirely sure why hybridization accelerated so sharply in the second half of the 20th century, though the most likely explanation involves a combination of increased feral cat populations in the Highland countryside and the contraction of wildcat numbers to the point where finding a pure wildcat mate became genuinely difficult. Whatever the cause, the genetic mixing proceeded with terrible efficiency. The result is a population that looks, in many individuals, something like a wildcat, but genetically is a complex mixture that makes identifying a genuinely pure animal an exercise requiring careful genetic analysis. Some researchers believe the number of truly pure wild-living wildcats remaining in Scotland may be very small, perhaps a few dozen at most, concentrated in the remotest and least human-modified parts of the Highland interior. The Scottish Wildcat Conservation Action Group concluded that there is no longer a viable wild population living free without the risk of extinction, and that releasing captive-bred animals into prepared sites is now the only realistic path forward. The captive breeding program has assembled wildcats from zoos and wildlife centres across Britain, genetically screening each animal to identify those with the least domestic cat ancestry, and has begun producing kittens in a carefully managed program designed to maintain the genetic diversity of what remains while building the numbers needed for an eventual reintroduction. The first releases back into prepared Highland sites began cautiously, with conservationists neutering feral and hybrid cats across designated areas to reduce the hybridization risk for any wildcats returned to the wild. It is an enormously complicated project, requiring coordination between dozens of organizations, requiring the cooperation of landowners and gamekeepers who have not always been the wildcats' friends, and requiring a level of sustained public and political support that is not guaranteed. What drives all of this effort is the knowledge of what the wildcat is, not what it was in the past or what it might be restored to. What it is right now in the cats that still carry a high proportion of wildcat ancestry. It is genuinely wild in a way that nothing else in Britain currently is. Wildcats cannot be domesticated. They have been tested by various researchers who have attempted to socialize captive-raised kittens from birth, and found that even hand-reared animals retain an extreme wariness of humans that deepens rather than diminishes with age. A wildcat does not decide to tolerate people the way that foxes and badgers and even pine martens sometimes do. It removes itself from human presence completely and permanently, retreating into the deepest cover available and operating in the hours when humans are absent. This is not a behavioral choice that has developed in response to persecution. It is genetic. It is fundamental. The wildcat has been wild for longer than anything alive in Britain, and it remains wild in its bones. And losing it would mean losing the last genuinely untamable thing the British Isles possess. Moving through the branches above the wildcat's territory, quick and dark and light-footed, is a creature whose story runs in the opposite direction. The pine marten is one of conservation's most encouraging recent narratives in Britain. A member of the weasel family, but large enough to be mistaken at a glance for a small cat, with its dark chocolate fur and distinctive cream bib, and its pointed face, and its remarkable agility in the tree canopy, the pine marten was also historically persecuted across Britain as a predator of game and poultry. By the mid-20th century, it had been reduced to a remnant population in the most remote Western Highlands of Scotland, hanging on in the pockets of native woodland that had not been entirely destroyed. What happened next was one of those slow reversals that conservation occasionally produces. Legal protection arrived. The persecution, while not eliminated, was reduced, and the pine marten began to spread back across the Highland landscape, recolonizing ancient territories from which it had been absent for generations. The spread was gradual, and then, in certain areas, surprisingly rapid, and as it spread, it began to do something that nobody had entirely predicted. The pine marten is a highly effective predator of grey squirrels. The grey squirrel, an introduced North American species, had been expanding across Britain since its release in the Victorian era, outcompeting the native red squirrel through a combination of greater body size, disease resistance, and more efficient processing of a wider range of food sources. Red squirrels had retreated to the north of Britain, largely to Scotland, holding on in the pockets of native forest that grey squirrels had not yet fully colonised. When the pine marten moved into areas where grey squirrels had established themselves, the grey squirrel population dropped. The explanation turned out to be straightforward. Grey squirrels are larger than red squirrels, more confident, more willing to feed on the ground, and more likely to be caught by a predator that hunts at all levels from the forest floor to the canopy. Red squirrels are lighter, faster in the canopy, and more arboreal in their behavior, spending more time high in the tree crowns where a pine marten still has less advantage. The marten is an effective enough predator to suppress grey squirrel populations significantly. And as grey squirrel numbers drop, red squirrel numbers recover in the same areas. Researchers studying this effect found that the recovery of red squirrels in areas with established pine marten populations was clear and measurable, and was happening through the simple mechanism of one predator keeping one prey species in check enough for a competing prey species to recover its ground. This is trophic cascade, the return of one predator unlocking the recovery of another species that the first predator does not even eat, through the indirect mechanism of controlling a competitor. It is exactly what rewilding theory predicts will happen when apex and mesopredators are restored to their ecological roles. And it is happening, quietly and without fanfare. In the recovering pine forests of the Scottish Highlands, driven by a chocolate-brown animal the size of a small cat that most people have never seen, the osprey arrived back in Scotland without human assistance. For decades, it was absent, the last breeding pair driven away by the twin pressures of egg collection and habitat loss in the early years of the 20th century. And then, in the 1950s, a pair from Scandinavia appeared at a loch in the Central Highlands and nested. They were discovered by conservationists who mounted a round-the-clock guard to protect the nest from the egg collectors who would certainly have targeted it if they had known it existed. The eggs hatched. The chicks survived. The following year, the pair returned, and the year after that, and slowly, across the following decades, the osprey population grew from that single pioneer pair into a self-sustaining and expanding presence in Scotland. The osprey hunts fish by plunging feet first into the water from considerable height, hitting the surface hard enough to drive its talons into a fish that may be swimming several feet below the surface. It then carries the fish back to its nest, repositioning it head forward in its grip to reduce wind resistance during the flight. Watching an osprey hunt is one of the most arresting wildlife experiences Scotland offers. The long patient circling above the water, the sudden commitment of the dive, the explosion of white water, and then the slow, powerful wing beats of an animal carrying a fish that may weigh as much as itself rising back into the sky. The osprey's return is, by any measure, a conservation success. What it demonstrates is that the landscape, if the direct pressures of persecution and egg collection are removed, can support the return of species that people thought were permanently gone. And that demonstration matters enormously in the context of what is being debated in Scotland right now, which is the question that puts the entire Highland wildlife story into its sharpest and most contested focus. should wolves and lynx come back. The wolves that once ranged across these hills were hunted to extinction by the late 17th century, killed partly for the livestock they took and partly as a general assertion of human control over the landscape. The lynx disappeared even earlier, and the timescale of their absence is long enough that most people living in Scotland today have no cultural memory of either animal. They exist here only in place names, in old legends, in the bones that occasionally surface from peat bogs, and in the research papers that try to quantify what their absence has cost the ecosystem. The case for returning them is built on the Yellowstone precedent, which has become the most cited ecological story in the rewilding movement. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the mid-1990s after a 70-year absence, the cascade of effects that followed was far larger than most people expected. The wolves reduced elk numbers and, more importantly, changed how elk used the landscape, driving them away from riverbanks and valley floors where their concentrated grazing had stripped the vegetation. The riverbanks revegetated, trees returned, river channels stabilized. The whole structure of the ecosystem shifted in response to the presence of a predator that the elk had adapted to fear over millions of years, but that had been absent long enough for the fear response to weaken. The term that ecologists use for what the wolves created is a landscape of fear, and the landscape of fear turned out to be more powerful than anyone had predicted. Scotland's situation is in some ways directly comparable. Without natural predators, red deer numbers have grown to levels that prevent forest regeneration across huge areas. The deer do not stay in any one place long enough to strip it completely bare, but they do stay long enough in any given area to eat every young tree that tries to establish itself, which means the forest cannot grow back, and the land remains open and wind-blasted and ecologically simple. The return of a predator would not necessarily reduce deer numbers dramatically in the short term. What it would do, according to the research, is change deer behavior. A deer that has to think about wolves does not stand still in the same riverbank for 3 days in a row. It moves, and in moving, it distributes its grazing pressure more evenly, giving trees a chance in the gaps. The lynx is the more realistic near-term candidate for reintroduction. Smaller than the wolf, specialized on roe deer rather than red deer, unlikely to threaten livestock in the way wolves might, and already successfully re-established in several parts of continental Europe. The lynx has been the focus of serious feasibility studies that suggest Scotland could support a viable population. The debate among conservationists, farmers, landowners, and the public is fierce and unresolved. Farmers worry about livestock losses. Deer stalking estates worry about reduced deer populations reducing their income. Rewilding advocates point to the ecological research and argue that the landscape damage caused by unchecked deer populations is already costing far more than any realistic livestock losses from lynx would. In January 2025, the debate was dramatically interrupted when 2 lynx were illegally released near a Highland town, roaming the hills for several hours before being captured. The animals appeared to be captive raised and showed no signs of having the behavioral toolkit needed for wild survival. The release was condemned by conservation organizations as irresponsible and counterproductive, potentially setting back the careful, evidence-based case for a legitimate reintroduction by associating the concept with a reckless stunt. But the incident also revealed the depth of passion on both sides, and the degree to which the question of what predators belong in the Scottish Highlands is no longer a fringe ecological debate, but a mainstream public conversation with real political weight. The broader ecological picture that frames this debate is stark. Scotland has lost most of its native forest. It has almost no land in a state that ecologists would describe as undisturbed or natural. The animals that were once part of its functioning ecosystem have been removed one by one over centuries, and what remains has been shaped not by natural processes, but by the hunting, farming, and land management decisions of a few thousand years of intensive human use. None of this is irreversible. The osprey's return proved that. The pine marten's spread proved that. The red squirrel's recovery in pine marten territory proved that. Each of these examples is a demonstration that the landscape still has the capacity to support more than it currently holds, if the direct pressures that emptied it are removed or reduced. The Caledonian forest, the ancient native woodland that once covered much of Scotland and that the Romans documented, now exists in fragments covering a tiny fraction of its original extent. Organizations like Trees for Life have been planting native trees and removing deer fencing and supporting natural regeneration in effort to expand what remains, and in some areas the results are striking. Where deer numbers are managed and tree planting is sustained, the forest comes back. Birch and rowan establish themselves. The understory fills in. Birds return. The insect communities that depend on native trees begin to recover. The whole biological machinery that was shut down when the forest was cleared begins to run again, slowly and tentatively, but genuinely. What is happening in Scotland right now is a live argument between the landscape that exists and the landscape that could exist, conducted by people with very different ideas about who the Highlands belong to and what they are for. The farmers and stalkers and estate managers who have worked this land for generations have a legitimate claim on its future. So do the conservation biologists and rewilding advocates, and the much larger public that has no economic stake in the land, but a profound emotional and cultural interest in what happens to it. And so, in a sense that is harder to articulate but no less real, do the red deer roaring in the autumn glens, and the golden eagle tilting against the grey sky, and the pine marten moving through the recovering woodland at dusk, and the handful of wildcats pressing deeper into the forest as the feral cats move in. Scotland stands at a turning point. The country that contains some of the most dramatic landscapes in Europe and some of the most depleted ecosystems in the developed world at the same time is actively debating which of those two truths it wants to define the next century. The rewilding movement has grown from a fringe idea to a genuine political force in a single generation. The language of ecological restoration is now part of mainstream Scottish environmental policy in a way it was not 20 years ago. Beavers, absent for centuries, have been formally reinstated as native species after a successful reintroduction program, and the public reaction to them has been overwhelmingly positive. The white-tailed eagle, the largest bird of prey in Britain, was reintroduced from Scandinavian stock decades ago and has now established itself to the point where breeding pairs occupy territories across the Western Highlands and Islands that had been silent of their calls for a century. Each of these recoveries is a proof of concept. It is evidence that the ecological clock is not set permanently to the hour when the last wolf was killed or the last lynx disappeared. It is evidence that given a chance, given legal protection, given reduced persecution and improved habitat, the wild things that belong here come back. Not quickly and not completely. And not without effort and conflict and genuine disagreement about the costs and benefits. But they come back. The golden eagle over the empty hillside, the pine marten through the recovering birchwood, the osprey dropping toward the loch surface, the wildcat pressing into the deepest cover it can find while people argue above it about its future, the red deer stag roaring into the autumn mist with nobody left to fear, and somewhere in the silence the absence of everything that once balanced this system, the wolves and lynx and bears that made this landscape what it was before we made it what it became. This is the Scottish Highlands, one of the most beautiful and most ecologically damaged wild places in the developed world, fighting to find its way back to something closer to what it was. Whether it succeeds depends on choices being made right now by governments and landowners and communities and individual people who decide that the bare hill and the empty glen are not good enough when there was once something so much wilder here. And those choices in a democracy are influenced by the number of people who understand what was lost and what could be recovered. The mountain hare is one of the smaller stories in the Highland ecosystem, but one of the more instructive. In summer, it carries a brown coat that blends with the heather and the tundra grasses of the high tops. In winter, triggered by the shortening of the days rather than the arrival of snow, it turns white. The timing of that change is set by photoperiod, by the length of daylight, not by temperature or the actual presence of snow. This means that in a warming climate, where snow arrives later or not at all, the mountain hare turns white on schedule, regardless of whether the ground beneath it is white. It becomes, in some winters now, a vivid white shape on a brown hillside, visible from considerable distances, precisely the opposite of what the camouflage system was designed to produce. The mountain hare is doing everything right. The environment is changing around it faster than evolution can keep pace with. This is one of the subtler but more profound ways in which climate change is pressing on the Scottish Highland ecosystem. The animals adapted to the cold are adapting to an environment that no longer exists in quite the form they evolved for. The capercaillie, the great forest grouse of the ancient pine woods, requires old-growth Caledonian pine forest for its survival and breeding, and is already so reduced in numbers that it is considered one of Britain's most threatened birds. The Caledonian forest. It depends on covers only fragments of its former range, and the capercaillie clings to those fragments with a tenacity that is remarkable given how much has been taken from it. The capercaillie is a bird that demands you see it to believe it. The males are enormous, dark-plumed, with a beard of bristled feathers below the bill and a tail that fans into a great spread during courtship displays. The display itself, called a lek, is one of the more theatrical wildlife spectacles that early spring produces in the Highlands. Before dawn, males gather at traditional display grounds in the pine woods and begin their extraordinary performance. A sequence of sounds and postures so bizarre that early observers struggled to describe them. The gobbling, clicking, popping sequence of sounds the male makes during display carries through the pre-dawn forest as something between a mechanical failure and a declaration of war. And the females who come to observe and choose among the displaying males respond with a selectivity that drives the whole elaborate show. The problem is that the trees the capercaillie depends on keep getting eaten by deer, and the deer keep getting eaten by nothing. And so the forest retreats, and the capercaillie retreats with it, and the lexites go quiet one by one as the trees that once sheltered them are grazed into stumps. The red fox is one of the few predators in the Highland ecosystem that has not suffered the fate of the wolf and the lynx and the wildcat. Adaptable to a degree that borders on impressive, the fox has navigated the transformation of the Scottish countryside by being useful enough on its own terms and small enough to fall below the threshold of the kind of intensive persecution that eliminated the larger predators. It hunts rabbits and voles and birds and takes advantage of whatever the landscape offers, including the eggs and young of ground-nesting birds and the occasional lamb, which is the source of the conflict with farming that keeps its relationship with landowners permanently uneasy. The fox is clever in the specific way that a generalist predator needs to be clever, able to read a situation and respond to it, to remember where food appeared before and return to check whether it has appeared again, to vary its approach depending on what has worked and what has not. It is not a substitute for the predators that are missing. It is too small to regulate deer. But it is a reminder that the predatory function of the ecosystem has not been entirely switched off, only drastically reduced. The Highland burn, running cold and clear over rounded stones with the peat dark colour that comes from the moorland it drains, carries a different kind of story. Atlantic salmon move through these streams on one of the most extraordinary migratory journeys in British wildlife, leaving the rivers as juveniles to spend years feeding and growing in the North Atlantic before returning, using mechanisms of navigation and olfactory memory that science is still not entirely able to explain, to the precise stretch of river where they were born. They return to spawn, pushing against the current, navigating the waterfalls and the shallow rapids of the Highland streams, their bodies changing from the silver of the sea fish to the darker, spotted colouring of a river fish as they move upstream. And in the gravel of the stream bed, where the current runs clean and oxygenated, they deposit their eggs and their genetic legacy, and, for many of them, their lives. The salmon is not a predator in the Highland ecosystem, but it is something almost as important. It is a transporter of nutrients. The body of a sea-feeding salmon that has spent years in the productive Atlantic, fattened on marine food webs, contains organic compounds that the Highland rivers themselves cannot produce in equivalent quantities. When that salmon dies in the headwaters after spawning, its body returns those marine nutrients to the freshwater ecosystem, feeding insects that feed birds that feed other predators, cycling the richness of the sea into the nutrient-poor upland environment in a process that has been called a river of life and a terrestrial subsidy from the ocean. Bears, when they existed in Scotland, gathered at Highland rivers to feed on spawning salmon. The bears that caught and ate and partially abandoned salmon carcasses were moving those marine nutrients directly onto the riverbanks and into the forest floor, where the trees could use them. The trees grew larger and faster near salmon rivers where bears had been active, their growth rings reflecting the marine productivity captured by fish and carried inland by bears. Bears are gone from Scotland. The nutrient pathway from ocean to forest floor is broken, and the rivers run a little less wild for it. Life wants to be here. The landscape still has the capacity to hold more than it currently holds. The bottleneck is always the same: the various ways that human activity either kills animals directly or degrades the habitat they need. In the long view, Scotland is at the beginning of something rather than the end of something. The political and cultural conversation about what wild nature should exist here and what role people should play in creating or allowing it has shifted more in the last 20 years than in the century before that. The rewilding concept, which asks not just what species need protection, but what ecological processes need restoration, has moved from academic ecology papers into mainstream political debate. The return of the beaver, the spread of the pine marten, the expansion of the white-tailed eagle, the careful campaigns to neuter feral cats around wildcat territories, on the feasibility studies for lynx and the passionate arguments about wolves. All of this is evidence that Scotland is actively wrestling with the question of what it wants its landscape to be. It is also evidence that the answer is not simple and will not be agreed upon quickly. The people who work the Highland land, the farmers and stalkers and crofters, have real and legitimate interests that a purely ecological argument does not always adequately address. The communities that depend on deer-stalking estates for employment and income cannot simply absorb the costs of a rewilded landscape without support and alternatives. The conversation about what comes back, and when, and where, has to be a genuine conversation, rather than a decision imposed from outside. The most successful conservation projects in Scotland have been the ones that worked with local communities rather than against them, that found ways of making wild nature economically valuable to the people living alongside it, and that took seriously the knowledge and experience of people who have spent generations reading the land. What the Highland landscape offers underneath the argument and the competing claims is something genuinely rare in a crowded, developed country. Scale, space, the raw material of a wild place waiting. The soils are still capable of growing the trees. The rivers are still capable of holding the fish. The skies are still wide enough for eagles. The glens are still deep enough for wolves to move through if they were allowed back. None of what was lost here is beyond recovery on the timescales that matter. The wildcat is still, just barely, in the deep forest. The golden eagle is still cutting through the grey Highland sky on wings that seem made for exactly this particular quality of light, this specific combination of cloud and mountain and wind. What happens next is a choice. Not a single choice made by a single person or government, but 1,000 choices made over decades by everyone who cares about what this place is and what it could become. The hills themselves are not waiting in the sense of needing rescue. They will exist in whatever form human decisions leave them. But the animals that belong in them, the ones that are still here, and the ones that could come back, are doing what wild things have always done, which is to press against the margins of what the current world allows and look for the gaps where life might expand again. The hills that the last wolves crossed before they were killed are still here. The rivers that the last bears fished are still running. The forest floor that the lynx walked through when Britain was still connected to the European mainland is still capable of growing the trees the lynx would move through. The ecological memory of this place runs deeper than the centuries of damage that have accumulated on top of it. The peregrine falcon cuts across the glen on wings that look impossibly small for the speed they carry. The fastest living thing on the planet in a dive, hunting grouse with a precision that is almost violent in its clarity. The red kite glides over the valley on its forked tail, turning slowly in the autumn air, its russet plumage warm against the grey sky above. The short-eared owl works the moorland edges at dusk, quartering low and steady over the rough grass, its yellow eyes finding movement that no human eye could detect in that light. These birds are here. They are alive in the Highland sky in numbers that reduce from what they once were, but still real, still present, still doing the work they were made for. Each of them is a fragment of the functional ecosystem that the Highlands once were, still operating, still pressing at the boundaries of what the current landscape allows, waiting like everything else in this place for the conditions that would let them be more fully what they are. If something from this landscape stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Tell me which animal. Tell me which part of the story. The hills are listening, and they have been waiting a long time for someone to bring back what belongs in them.